Now let's begin. Story 1. When Artemis accidentally invented camping. You are walking through the thinning light of a late afternoon in the ancient Peloponnesian mountains. There are no roads, no bustling agoras, and certainly no temples. Only the rustle of pine trees and the distant chirping of cicadas accompany you. If you look closely, you can almost see a figure in the distance, tall, stern, unadorned. This is Artemis, goddess of the hunt, wilderness, and chastity. But today she is not majestic or terrifying. Today she is packing. You see, even divine beings have logistics. The realities of divine travel. Despite popular imagination, gods didn't just snap their fingers and arrive where they pleased. Artemis, known for her preference for remote wilderness, often traveled deep into forests and high into uninhabited mountains. And travel then, as now, required planning. Artemis was not alone. She traveled with a band of nymphs, young maidens who followed her vow of chastity and supported her hunts. These were not warriors or powerful entities. They were, quite literally, glorified interns. And like any group of interns facing a 3-week off-grid wilderness excursion, they needed shelter, food, water, fire, and most importantly, structure. Building the base camp, a divine afterthought. The camp, if it could be called that, was rudimentary. Using vines, large leaves, and the occasional borrowed canvas from passing shepherds, Artemis' entourage would build temporary shelters, lean-tos, and tent-like structures held up with spears and bows. In modern camping terms, this wasn't glamping. It wasn't even organized. Each hunt would begin with several hours of arguing about where to put the sleeping areas, whether the food stores should be kept near the river or up in the rocks, and who forgot the extra tinder. According to later Homeric commentaries, there was a recurring issue in Artemis hunting parties. The nymphs often misplaced their supplies. One fragment even suggests that Artemis once spent 4 days looking for a missing quiver, which had been used to prop up a poorly constructed awning. The quiver, when found, was filled with rainwater and had become home to a family of frogs. This is not the story told in heroic epics, but it is history. Food in the forest. One of the most critical and boring aspects of Artemis' wild excursions was food. The goddess of the hunt, naturally, expected to kill her meals. But in practice, the kills were few and far between, and the diet of her followers consisted mostly of barley cakes, dried figs, olives, and a strange cheese wrapped in fig leaves that had to be eaten quickly before it attracted ants. Hunting, in the classical sense, was often ceremonial. It was not about daily sustenance, but about ritual. This meant that on most days, Artemis and her followers relied on pre-packed supplies from nearby villages or sympathetic shepherds. There's a forgotten anecdote, buried in a 2nd century BCE regional record from Arcadia, where an old woman named Thuro documented delivering a dozen bundles of barley flatbread and 2 wineskins to a strange maiden with silver eyes who paid in polished stones. The goddess herself, perhaps, or a local priestess cosplaying. The records don't clarify, but what they do show is that even divine wilderness trips involved supply chains. The hygiene problem. Long excursions into the wilderness presented another problem: hygiene. No one likes to discuss how the gods dealt with bowel movements, but scrolls from ancient sanctuaries often included prayers for cleanliness, mentions of night pots, and rituals of purification involving spring water and herbs. Artemis, associated with purity, likely had strict routines. Some believe she was the first to enforce designated hygiene zones away from camp, marked with carved branches and sacred stones. One archaeological dig in Thessaly unearthed what is believed to be an early latrine area near a suspected Artemis shrine, complete with ash pits and rudimentary drainage trenches. It may be the least glamorous discovery in Greek religious archaeology, but it speaks volumes. Gods, it seems, preferred their waste downhill and downwind just like everyone else. Campfire politics and nightly routines. As dusk fell and the cicadas quieted, the real routine began. A single fire was built no more, lest it attract attention. Around this fire, nymphs would sit in order of seniority, not by strength, but by who had been around the longest. Those who brought gossip from nearby villages were especially favored. What did they talk about? Boring things, where the water skin leaked, who had ruined the thread on their sandals, and which mortal men had looked too long at them while passing through the woods. Artemis, silent and distant, often remained apart, polishing her arrows or studying maps etched into tree bark. This time of day, the twilight hour, was when Artemis felt most herself, not because of some divine insight, but because things finally got quiet. No one asked her where to pitch a tent. No one spilled the fig wine. No one used her bow as a clothesline. The modern idea of camping as recreation would have confused her. This was not leisure. It was solitude. It was control. It was a place where she could be distant from Olympus, free of temples and offerings. And yet, even here, with all her power and majesty, she found herself constantly answering the same question. Who took my flint? The accidental innovation. Historians now believe that Artemis, repeated forays into wilderness travel complete with lean-tos, foraged food, and supply runs, laid the mythological foundation for the concept of camping. Not that she meant to, but over centuries, her stories were retold by mortals who saw in them a kind of structure, a strange mix of survival and simplicity. Temple ruins from Boeotia include a shrine to Artemis Campingia, Artemis of the camps, a minor epithet lost to history, but one that speaks volumes. Somewhere along the way, Artemis stopped being just the huntress. She became the symbol of organized wilderness retreat, with rules, routines, and really uncomfortable bedding. Camping, in a sense, was invented by accident, not as an act of recreation, but as a divine necessity, because even immortals need a place to rest. Closing thought. As the fire dies down and the camp falls silent, Artemis stands watch, a goddess surrounded by improvised tents and unwashed linen. She is proud, stern, and unyielding, but she still can't find her flint. And so you might wonder, was the essence of Artemis truly power and purity? Or was it simply the quiet, tired patience of someone who chose solitude over spectacle? The campfire had burned down to a quiet core of red, breathing coals. Around it, the nymphs lay curled on woven mats and hides, their limbs tangled, their hair dusted with pine needles. Overhead, the stars blinked with the indifference of eternity. But Artemis did not sleep. She sat with her back against a tree, her bow across her lap, and her thoughts elsewhere. This was not divine vigilance. This was insomnia brought on by inefficiency. She had been reviewing mentally the failures of the day. 2 lost sandals, 1 collapsed shelter, a torn water skin, and an argument between 2 senior nymphs about whether wild thyme or mint kept away insects better. The goddess had not been annoyed. She had been quietly seething. And it was on this quiet, exasperated night that Artemis invented something extraordinary. Something that would change history not with fanfare, but with procedures. She invented the camp rulebook. An unexpected bureaucrat. History rarely speaks of Artemis as an organizer. She is remembered as a huntress, a fierce protector, a bringer of sudden death to those who broke oaths. But these same traits, precision, boundary enforcement, and high expectations, made her particularly suited to a kind of wilderness order. Somewhere between dawn and the first rustling of pine cones falling, Artemis began carving into a flat piece of bark with the tip of her arrowhead. She created symbols, rules, a list of what would become the first wilderness code. No campfire after the 3rd watch. Water must be drawn upstream. Waste must be buried. Bows are not to be used as laundry poles. The first awake tends the fire. The last asleep clears the embers. Food rations are to be counted every 2 days. Each nymph is responsible for their own gear. No one touches Artemis flint, ever. This was not an act of divine revelation. It was more akin to exhausted irritation solidified into policy. Yet, like many such policies, it brought stability. And soon, unexpectedly, it brought reverence. The rise of ritualized camping. As the days stretched on, the new rules began to take effect. Each nymph was assigned a duty: fire watch, water collection, perimeter walk. Arguments lessened. Equipment stayed where it belonged. Even the cooking stones were cleaned more often. It wasn't discipline for discipline's sake. These systems reduced stress. The goddess herself could rest, knowing the camp would not dissolve into chaos. Artemis' authority had always been absolute, but now it took on a quiet structure. Her camp began to run like a small, mobile temple devoted not to marble or incense, but to silence, awareness, and survival. And the rules traveled. One of her senior nymphs, Callianera, returned from a seasonal pilgrimage and brought with her a copy of the bark-carved rules. She shared them with local shrine keepers, who passed them along to villagers. Over the years, the rules of Artemis became standard fare for shepherds, traveling priests, and even militia camps. One fragment from a 4th century BCE training manual for Arcadian border guards includes a rule that reads, "Night waste must be buried, not near the fire ring. The lady of the forest sees disorder as a sign of weakness." It's not exactly divine wrath, but it's effective. The role of the nymphs, logistics managers in laurel wreaths. The modern view of nymphs is soft, dreamlike woodland spirits lounging in brooks and groves. But under Artemis' leadership, they became something far more grounded, the wilderness's first logistical experts. Each nymph, depending on her strengths, took on a role. Drapanes, the tallest and least squeamish, was in charge of food butchering and preparation. Melanth, who once had a fascination with counting seeds, was the inventory keeper. Ione, a quick-footed runner, was tasked with scouting for water and reporting any intrusions, animal or mortal. Phoenix, the most senior, kept track of rules and punished violations by assigning extra firewood collection. It wasn't glamorous, but it was order. The divine nature of Artemis may have elevated these roles, but they were still rooted in very mundane tasks: counting, sorting, scrubbing, fetching, maintaining. The real miracle wasn't divine power, it was the ability to run a sustainable wilderness camp for weeks at a time without catastrophe. And this, more than any thunderbolt or magic bow, left a mark on human behavior. Historical echoes, sacred forest camps and proto-military encampments. As Greek culture evolved, Artemis camping practices were absorbed into other structures. Sacred festivals often involved long treks into the woods to commune with nature in her honor. And as more soldiers and pilgrims traveled through the backcountry, many adopted the divine rules of camp life. Archaeological remains from Boeotian way stations show distinct sleeping circles, waste pits, and central fire stones, layout structures eerily similar to the arrangements of Artemis' own camps, described in oral tradition and late Hellenistic pastoral poetry. In a rather dry fragment from the Boeotian temple maintenance ledger, c. 190 BCE, an unnamed steward records, "A cluster of girls dressed not as acolytes but as scouts arrived with bark scrolls of the goddess Order. Their sleeping spaces were mapped in a square around a single pine with waste buried to the east. They paid in figs and stories. We left them undisturbed." It is easy to dismiss these details as quaint, but they represent the codification of mobile sacred space, of treating the wilderness not as a threat, but as a temporary home with structure and dignity. Solitude as a system. It would be wrong to suggest Artemis welcomed others into her peace. She remained, by all accounts, deeply private, but her nymphs grew older. Some left, some stayed, others were replaced, and over time the goddess routines hardened into something more permanent. There are tales of mortals stumbling upon Artemis, campsites long after they were abandoned still neat, the fire rings intact, leaf bedding swept to the side. 1 century BCE shepherd's tale speaks of finding a perfectly coiled rope near a spring, a sacred stone left behind beside it. He took nothing. He left an offering, and he never returned. It is this idea that solitude can be sustained with intention that carried Artemis' influence far beyond myth, not through divine violence or cosmic acts, but through a meticulous, almost obsessive love of order in chaos. Gods and the burden of leadership. Leadership is rarely depicted as lonely in Greek mythology, yet Artemis offers a quiet counterpoint. She is rarely seen among crowds. She is not political, not prone to speeches, but she leads through precision. Her camp, her rules, her routines, these are how she maintains distance while protecting her followers. A divine boundary enforced not through fire but through logistics. And in the process, she teaches something rarely celebrated in epic verse, that effective survival is often built on monotony, on doing the boring thing the right way every time, on counting figs, on remembering where the rope is stored, on waking up to feed the fire before anyone else stirs. A feminine order, rooted in repetition. It's worth noting that Artemis Camp was an all-female space, not by accident but by design. No men, no exceptions. This created a self-contained structure, a proto-matriarchal society with clearly defined roles. Without outside influence, these camps developed their own internal hierarchies and customs, many of which were quietly adopted into rural communities. In Thessaly, certain villages held maiden retreats in the forests, structured entirely on Artemis rules. Young women would go into the woods for 5 nights, build a shelter, gather food, and keep fire. When they returned, they were considered ready for marriage not because of chastity, but because they had demonstrated survival, cooperation, and attention to detail. These rites were quietly powerful. They offered women a space not only to be away from society, but to run one. Not all who wander are lost, but some are disorganized. Of course, not everyone adopted Artemis' ways. The god Pan, for example, is the antithesis of organized camping. His stories are filled with confusion, missing flutes, and misadventures in tangled brush. One tale speaks of Pan attempting to replicate Artemis' camp only to accidentally set his bedding on fire while trying to roast chestnuts. His attempt to enforce camp rules ended with a stampede of wild goats and 2 very irritated river spirits. The contrast is clear. Artemis represents calm, intentional solitude. Pan represents chaos. And while both embody nature, only one built something others wanted to repeat. Closing thought. So as Artemis sits by the fire, watching the sky shift from velvet to cobalt, she is not triumphant. She is not hunted. She is not even particularly content. But she knows deeply, quietly, that what she has made here is something rare, a space that sustains itself, a structure that does not demand attention but prevents collapse. And as another pine cone falls nearby, she makes a mental note to add a 9th rule. Always check above before choosing your sleeping spot. After all, even the goddess of the wilderness can be surprised by squirrels. By the time Artemis' latest camp broke its pattern of routine with something extraordinary, a sudden, chaotic burst of visitors, it had already become, in every practical sense, a mobile institution. Yet this interruption, unlike the usual disturbances from curious shepherds or gossiping village girls, would threaten not just the peace of her woodland operations, but the very idea of a private, sacred wilderness. Because someone brought a boy. Not a god, not a hero, just a mortal boy named Actaeon. The incident that wasn't a catastrophe. The traditional myth is known. Actaeon, a Theban hunter, stumbles upon Artemis bathing. She is enraged. In most versions, she turns him into a stag and his own hounds tear him apart. But that's the dramatic, poetic telling heavy with symbolism and divine vengeance. The older, lesser-known accounts are more ambiguous. A 2nd century BCE fragment found on a clay tablet near Lake Capais contains a far duller and perhaps more honest version. It reads, roughly translated: "The boy passed the threshold, saw what was sacred, and was turned away. His return was never known. The nymph scrubbed the stone clean. Artemis did not speak of it." In this version, Actaeon isn't punished in fire and fury. He is quietly erased, not killed but gently excluded. Artemis, deeply private and methodical, may have found violence too disruptive to camp life. The lesson was not about terror, but about boundaries. And like many things in Artemis camp, it was handled with quiet finality. The sanctity of space, of order, of rules, this was her true power. And crossing those boundaries, even accidentally, required not divine wrath but divine insulation. You simply were not allowed in again. When order becomes worship. By the end of the classical period, Artemis, camping traditions had outgrown her. Across the Hellenic world, rural shrines and forest sanctuaries sprang up that mimicked her wilderness order. Archaeological finds in central Arcadia reveal a series of small campsites, each with circular hearths, eastward-aligned latrines, and low stone platforms possibly used for sleeping mats. No formal temples, just stone-lined clearings with strict geometry. Worshippers left offerings not of gold or incense, but of rope, dried herbs, and bundles of firewood. In Delphi, during a short-lived summer festival known as the Hemerokympeia, young temple acolytes would camp outside the sanctuary walls for 3 nights. The goal? To reflect Artemis' values of independence, silence, and survival. Every meal was self-prepared, every action logged on scrolls. One surviving log reads, "Third night, 3 figs each. No fire after dark, 2 violations of silence. Tomorrow, reparation through early watch duty." These were not acts of punishment. They were rituals of learning. They taught the one thing Artemis valued most, the core of her accidental invention: endurance through structure. Artemis leaves no temples behind. Most major Greek gods left grand temples in their honor. Artemis had a few, of course the famed one at Ephesus among them. But that temple was more about imperial grandeur than wilderness reverence. Her true sanctuaries were scattered in woods, etched into bark, whispered in rules passed down through generations of women, hunters, scouts, and solitary travelers. This decentralization wasn't failure. It was success of a different kind. Artemis' influence was not confined to stone and marble. It was embedded in how people moved through the world. How you made a fire and covered the embers. How you cleaned your blade and your hands. How you created a sleeping space that would not disturb the grove. To honor Artemis was not to build. It was to move and live with precision. To leave no mark but the memory of stillness. From myth to manual. By the Hellenistic period, Artemis practices became embedded in early Greek literature on survival and movement. The 1st century BCE military treatise Piri Stratopdeas, on campcraft, while ostensibly focused on armies, includes rules lifted almost word for word from what is now referred to as the Artemis Code. Camps must be cleared at dawn. Waste is to be buried at twice the depth of a hand's span. Fire pits must be covered and disguised upon departure. And in a curious aside, the text notes, "These are not inventions of soldiering, but of forest wisdom, long kept by maidens who never served in war yet knew how not to perish." Even the Roman legions, famed for their disciplined camp setups, mirrored some of these principles: triangular sleeping arrangements, latrines placed downwind, strict duties and rotations. It's tempting to think some of these concepts were inherited from Artemis' original, accidental innovations. The quietness of her influence was its strength. Camping as philosophy. At its heart, Artemis' approach to wilderness wasn't just about survival. It was a philosophy, a way of seeing the world not as a threat to be conquered, but as a space to exist within without dominance, without waste. The forest was not a backdrop, it was a cohabitant. This is reflected in the reverence given to camp construction. There was no shouting, no unnecessary tool use. Trees were bent, not broken. Stones were moved, not shattered. Fires were kept low, and all items brought in were eventually carried out. Even sleeping arrangements followed natural clearings rather than clearing space forcibly. Artemis taught that nature need not be endured. It could be respected, and that respect could be made real through routine, repetition, and restraint. Artemis in the modern mind. Fast forward a few thousand years, and Artemis is mostly a myth again, tamed, romanticized, reduced to symbols and schoolbook summaries. But her influence is still with us, in odd little corners. The wilderness codes of backcountry hikers, the leave no trace principles taught to scouts, the quiet reverence of solo campers who seek not adventure but silence. In these rituals, packing out your trash, setting up your tent away from the trail, burying waste far from water sources, you find echoes of the forest goddess, not in name, but in practice. And if you were to ask a ranger or a trail elder why these rules exist, you might get a long explanation about ecology, wildlife safety, and respect for future visitors. But you could also say, because Artemis wrote them on a piece of bark once, when she was tired of losing her flint. A final night in the camp. Let us return to the quiet camp once more. The night is older now, and the fire is just a whisper. The nymphs sleep, worn and silent. A single owl watches from a crooked olive tree. Artemis is writing again, not poetry, not prophecy, just a new rule. Rule 10. If the quiet is good, do not break it. She places the bark near the coals, not to burn, but to warm it dry. In the morning, it will be sealed with pine resin and carried to the next camp. Or perhaps it will be forgotten, lost in the moss, reclaimed by the forest. But it doesn't matter, because someone will find it, and someone will learn, and someone will follow. Final reflection. Artemis never sought worship in the way others did. She did not demand statues or chants or sprawling rituals. She demanded order, boundaries, and respect for silence. And through that quiet, she gave the world something deeply human. A way to exist in wilderness without becoming wild. So the next time you roll up your blanket, douse your fire, and look up at the stars before sleep, remember that even the gods once laid under those same skis, wondering how to keep the water skin from leaking. And they wrote a rule about it. Story 2. Hermes and the First Inventory Log. You are standing in the dusty haze of an early morning somewhere in the dry plains of ancient Arcadia. The sun has barely crested the hills, casting long shadows behind you, but already there's the lowing of cattle in the distance, and a faint trail of footprints leading sideways. If you follow them and you find something strange, hoofprints, but not just any hoofprints, these are backward. This, you will soon discover, is the work of Hermes, but not the fleet-footed messenger of Olympus, not yet. This is Hermes as an infant barely a day old, swaddled in mischief, and wrapped in the earliest form of record-keeping confusion the ancient world had ever known. And with that, we step quietly into one of the most overlooked inventions of Greek myth, the inventory log. A god is born and immediately overcommits. Hermes was born in a cave in Arcadia to Maya, a nymph who valued peace, privacy, and extremely quiet mornings. The son of Zeus, Hermes came into the world not screaming but smirking, if the old hymns are to be believed. Within hours of his birth, he escaped his swaddling cloth, crept out of the cave, and embarked on what history calls his first great act of theft. His goal, to steal 50 cattle from his half-brother Apollo. Now most myths focus on the cleverness of the trick, the backward hooves, the trail disguised, the quiet return. But what often goes unspoken is the logistical disaster this created. Because after all the theft and trail blurring, Hermes had a problem. He had no idea how many cattle he'd taken. The challenge of counting. Stealing cattle isn't just about secrecy. It's about tracking. And Hermes, for all his brilliance, had not considered the administrative burden. He had taken the cattle to a quiet ravine, hidden between two folds of rock, shaded by low cypress and juniper. But as the beasts milled about, lowing and shuffling, a growing dread settled on the godling. How many were there? He had counted them, hadn't he? He thought it was 50, but had one escaped, had a few doubled back, worse had he taken one twice. This was not an abstract problem, it was a counting crisis. And so Hermes sat on a rock and did what no god had done before. He began to log. Stones, marks, and the first ledger. The materials were simple: a flat piece of shale, a stick, a handful of small river pebbles. He assigned each pebble to a cow and etched a mark for each in the stone. He arranged the stones in rows, scratched lines beneath them, then realizing they'd roll away, built a tiny wall of twigs and mud to hold them in place. Then he recounted. Each cow that passed back through the narrow ravine got a stone moved to the right. The method was slow, but it worked. Hermes had created a basic movable ledger, a form of live inventory using physical markers. Later myths would attribute to him the invention of language, trade, and the lyre. But perhaps his greatest innovation, born of boredom and panic, was this: the practice of tracking what you take. Apollo notices the missing. Meanwhile, back in Thessaly, Apollo was experiencing something no Olympian enjoyed: uncertainty. The cows were gone, the trail was unclear, and none of the usual omens or divine signs offered guidance. Why? Because Hermes' deception was thorough and fundamentally mundane. He hadn't used magic, he'd used method. This annoyed Apollo, who favored prophetic visions and dramatic revelation. But as he searched and questioned and stewed, a curious pattern emerged. Shepherds along the route mentioned seeing strange arrangements of stones, rows and piles, scratched symbols, tiny twig pens near empty paths. Apollo, unused to such earthy clues, was baffled. He didn't realize it, but he was looking at a new technology, a system of signs. Inventory as revelation. Eventually, Apollo found Hermes and dragged him by the ear, no less to Mount Olympus to stand trial before Zeus. The confrontation, as told in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, is theatrical. Hermes denies everything, claims to be too young, too innocent. He even suggests he can't count yet. But there's a moment, often skipped in retellings, when Zeus asks, "If you didn't take them, why are there tally marks scratched into the rocks by the ravine?" God, Hermes, ever adaptable, shrugs. "I was organizing." Zeus pauses, then smiles. Because here's the secret no one says aloud. Even gods appreciate a good logbook. From divine crime to divine order. And so the crime is forgiven, mostly because of its novelty. Hermes returns the cattle, makes peace with Apollo by gifting him the lyre, and is eventually granted dominion over trade, travel, and thieves. But in that origin story is something more mundane and more powerful. The roots of administrative control. The Hermetic method, as it would later be called in temple accounting, was simple. Assign one item to one symbol. Create a fixed space to organize movement. Record transitions, not just totals. This method, rudimentary as it was, formed the basis of temple records across the ancient Greek world. Administrative adoption. By the 6th century BCE, temple treasurers in Delphi, Delos, and Eleusis were using stylized tokens and markings on clay to track ritual offerings. Shrines developed logbooks, some on parchment, others etched into wooden boards. In a fragmentary ledger from Eleusis, c. 510 BCE, a priest notes, All items received for Artemis feast. 3 olive oil jars marked in Hermes order, moved left to right, tokens collected in basin. The phrase Hermes order becomes shorthand for systematic record keeping. Not divine decree, just good documentation. The underappreciated innovation. It's easy to overlook what Hermes did because it's overshadowed by his flair. But let's break it down. He took physical items, stones, and gave them symbolic value, cattle. He used space, right and left piles, to track movement, present versus counted. He introduced redundancy, a mark on a stone, and an etched line on the surface. He used these tools to detect discrepancies, an early audit system. In modern terms, Hermes invented the inventory sheet, the token system, the error check, and all because he was a disorganized thief who wanted to avoid embarrassment. Closing thought. As Hermes stood before Zeus, hands muddy and eyes wide, he wasn't defending a crime. He was presenting a system, a way to know what's yours, what's missing, and what never was. Inventory, after all, isn't about greed, it's about memory. So the next time you check your bag twice before a trip, or count your keys before leaving the cafe, or update that spreadsheet, because the numbers don't add up, remember that a baby god once sat in a ravine with pebbles and twigs, trying to figure out if he'd stolen 49 cows or 51. He never did say for sure. The myth of Hermes stealing Apollo's cattle makes for a cheeky divine anecdote. But its quiet legacy, his accidental invention of keeping track of things, slowly infiltrated mortal life in ways far more consequential than even the lyre or the winged sandals. Inventory, bookkeeping, and ledger-keeping were not things the poets sang about. There were no odes to supply chains, no hymns to grain tallies, and yet, in every temple, marketplace, and granary across the Greek world, it was these dull systems, tedious, meticulous, repetitive, that kept society functioning. In this section, we explore how Hermes' earliest method of counting turned into a sacred, widespread, and utterly unglamorous industry, temple accounting. From pebbles to parapigmata, Hermes' earliest record system, according to tradition, used pebbles and marks essentially, a symbolic abstraction of real-world items. This early form evolved into more durable forms. Wooden tablets coated with wax, where numbers could be scratched in and smoothed over. Stone parapigmata, a kind of calendar inventory hybrid, mounted on walls. Clay seals used to tag goods with ownership or content before being stored. By the 7th century BCE, temple functionaries were routinely recording offerings, donations, sacrificial animals, grain stores, and ritual items in ledgers. These scribes were not priests but specialists, some literate, others using pictographic systems based on Hermes' symbolic organization. One of the earliest surviving parapigmata from Earthry includes this carved sequence. 3 amphorae of oil for the festival, counted, sealed, 1 broken, recorded by Diopides. No gods, no grandeur, just broken pottery and a name. But it shows something crucial, someone noticed and wrote it down. Temples as warehouses. Temples were more than places of worship, they were economic hubs. People didn't just bring prayers, they brought things. Livestock, dried fruits, olive oil, woven cloth, bronze tools, and in some cases coinage. These items had to be received, logged, stored, maintained, and often redistributed during festivals or lean seasons. For instance, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi didn't just accept tributes, it cataloged them in painstaking detail. Inscribed stone steel from the 5th century BCE list. Number of coins donated. Weight and purity of metals. Number and condition of animal hides. Dates of arrival. Names of donors. This wasn't about divine favor, it was inventory control. And whose symbols did they use? The Hermes system. The rise of the hermetic clerk. As temples grew, a new class of worker emerged, the hermetic clerk. These individuals were trained not in poetry, warfare, or oracles, but in counting. Their role was not to interpret dreams, but to document reality. They maintained ledgers, cross-checked donation records, created lists of items to be offered during specific festivals, and ensured no item went missing between rituals. One such clerk, Cleisthenes of Argos, became somewhat famous not for heroics, but for writing the longest known inventory log from the classical period. His tablet, found in a temple ruin near Argos, includes 312 entries over 4 years. Among them, 1 bronze scale chipped at edge, 2 lengths of linen, moth-damaged, burned, and recorded, 1 goat, sick upon arrival, ritually accepted, but separated from flock. This kind of detail, so easily overlooked, formed the backbone of temple economics. Mistakes in the margins. But even gods make errors, and so did their clerks. In a rare surviving complaint from a Corinthian temple in the 4th century BCE, a local scribe named Nesicles writes, "There is dispute regarding the seal of the 5th amphora. It was marked thrice, not twice. The barley within was short by a handful. The weight was double-checked. The offering stands, but the error is noted." This reveals a subtle but important truth. Even sacred items could be mishandled, miscounted, or misunderstood. The role of the Hermes-style ledger was not just to account for abundance, it was to document discrepancies, to admit uncertainty, to create a paper trail, even when parchment was rare. Inventory, in this way, became the beginning of transparency. The invention of item codes. To make this process easier, temples eventually began categorizing goods by type and condition. In Athens, around 430 BCE, records from the Parthenon's treasury show Code 1A equals new bronze implements. Code 2B equals used cloth, acceptable. Code 3C equals spoiled perishables, unfit for sacrifice. This tiered system helped priests decide what could be used in rituals, what could be distributed to the poor, and what needed to be buried or burned. While there's no definitive proof that Hermes directly created this system, the shorthand structure mirrors his original practice of assigning meaning to objects in groups. In other words, the gods had labels, and once they had labels, they had categories, and once they had categories, they had rules for sorting. That's not myth, that's filing. Marketplace spillover. As temple accounting grew more sophisticated, merchants took notice. Early Greek traders, especially those working across islands, began borrowing Hermes, symbolic systems for their own purposes. Clay tablets discovered in Naucratis, a trading outpost in Egypt, bear inscriptions of shipment logs, expected weight comparisons, storage symbols for cool, dry, and fragile. A trader named Timon of Rhodes even developed a system where each type of good received a carved seal with a simplified Hermes symbol, a wing, a sandal, a lyre, or a scroll. These were arguably the first branding logos, but more importantly, they acted as receipts. One tablet fragment reads, "This jar of myrrh was sealed with the wing, therefore it was counted." Again, the divine becomes mundane. The wing of Hermes, once a symbol of speed, becomes a symbol of accountability. Record-keeping as sacred duty. Eventually, the overlap between the sacred and the administrative blurred entirely. In some temples, failure to log properly was considered a ritual offense. If a scribe omitted an item, it was believed that the gods might see it as a theft, not from the priests but from the gods themselves. One legal tablet from Thebes states, "The man who forgets the 4th portion of oil shall pour libation twice and fast for a day." These weren't dramatic punishments. They were slow, symbolic corrections, just enough to remind everyone records matter. Because if the gods knew all and saw all, then surely they remembered all. And if a mortal failed to keep pace, even with numbers, it was a spiritual failure, not just an administrative one. Why this was revolutionary? It's easy to take this for granted. Today, ledgers are digital, inventories are apps, barcodes tell us what something is and where it belongs. But in a time when oral memory ruled and writing was expensive, what Hermes initiated, the externalization of memory, was profound. He didn't just steal cattle, he recorded them. He didn't just invent deception, he invented documentation. And in doing so, he allowed mortals and immortals alike to plan, reflect, audit, and build systems that could outlast them. Because once something is written down, it can be handed off, passed on, protected. That's not trickery, that's administration. Closing thought. In the dust of the ancient world, amid temples, markets, and goat pens, there were no grand monuments to Hermes, logs. No epic poems about scribes hunched over wooden boards. But somewhere, deep in a cave or a ravine, a child god once sat surrounded by stones and hoofprints, trying to understand what he'd done. He didn't just invent theft, he invented the fear of not knowing if you counted correctly. And from that fear came a practice that built economies, stabilized temples, and taught people the value of boring, blessed clarity. So the next time you mark an item off a checklist or balance your books at midnight, know that you're not just being organized. You're performing a quiet ritual, one that began in a panic, with a handful of pebbles, and the overwhelming suspicion that you might have lost a cow. As the centuries rolled on, the temples wore down. Earthquakes cracked their columns. Floods washed away their foundations. War and empire turned once sacred treasuries into pillaged ruins or forgotten heaps of weathered stone. But something curious happened. The ledgers etched on tablets, inscribed on stone, scratched into wax, outlasted the rituals they were made to serve. What began as a baby god's tally of stolen cows turned into one of the quietest revolutions in history, the immortalization of boring details. And as the divine faded, the lists remained. A temple crumbles, but the log survives. Consider the temple of Artemis at Broron. By the 2nd century BCE, it had already suffered from neglect. Columns had shifted. Vines crept across the altars. The offerings slowed to a trickle. But during a 19th century excavation, archaeologists uncovered something remarkably intact. A slate slab etched with dozens of entries: clothes, oils, utensils, and sacrificial knives. Some items had ticks beside them, others were crossed out. No poetry, no prayers. Just a woman's hand, possibly a priestess or a clerk, quietly keeping track of who brought what and when. One entry simply reads, "Doro's one knife not returned." This might seem mundane, but it reflects something fundamental. The gods may stop listening, but the records remain. The shift from divine to civil inventory. As temples declined, cities rose. City councils and municipal treasuries took over many functions once managed by sacred orders, but the ledgers remained the same. In Athens, city magistrates used tablets identical in form to temple ledgers to track tax contributions, land use quotas, voting eligibility, military gear distribution. The tools of Hermes were no longer just sacred, they were civic. They had been absorbed into the bones of the state. Even the ostraka pottery shards used in voting were indexed. One archivist from the 5th century BCE created what may have been the first voting receipt log, etched on stone beside the entrance to the Pnyx. He wasn't a politician or an oracle, just a clerk with a stylus and a habit of nodding who scratched which name. The invention of the forgettable hero. The scribes, clerks, and list makers of ancient Greece were not remembered by name. Not really. There are no surviving statues of temple inventory keepers, no bronze plaques for tally stick operators. Their names, if noted at all, appear in the margins. Written by Lysandra, she of the clean hand. Logged by Phanes, son of no one important. And yet their work persists. Clay fragments, charred scrolls, tablets long buried under dirt all speak to a quiet heroism that doesn't claim glory but ensures things don't fall apart. Because someone always had to know how many jars of oil were left, whether the goats had been counted, which spear went missing before the festival. Without them, the rituals couldn't happen, the meals couldn't be portioned, the cities couldn't prepare. They didn't fight monsters, they counted them. Hermes, god of movement and stillness. Hermes' reputation evolved over time. He became the patron of travelers, traders, thieves, diplomats. But across temple walls and merchant seals, another title appears, rare and dry, but significant. Hermes Logios, Hermes of the records. This epithet, used sparingly and mostly by clerks themselves, highlights a facet of the god often forgotten. Yes, he moved fast. Yes, he tricked and whispered and ran. But he also paused. He stopped long enough to count, to compare, to draw lines in the dirt and move pebbles one at a time. The original tale of the cattle theft becomes almost a parable. Even the most chaotic gods need a moment of stillness to make sense of what they've done. Inventories as stories. Every list tells a story, and in the ancient world that story was survival. A list of grain reserves after a bad harvest wasn't just numbers, it was a measure of how many would make it through the winter. A list of ritual knives told you who had fallen out of favor, who had grown careless, who owed. And in one particularly telling example from Delos, a surviving logbook contains this final entry, hastily scratched near the bottom edge. The sea came, we took what we could, left 3 jars in the statue's left hand. There is no follow-up. That's not just inventory, it's history. The quiet wisdom of logging what matters. There's a common thread in Hermes' legacy. Not that he created systems of power, but that he helped people remember. Memory in the ancient world was sacred. Poets relied on it. Priests invoked it. Laws were once memorized before they were written. But Hermes broke the spell. He externalized memory. He gave it form. A list, a mark, a stone moved to the left. And in doing so, he made knowledge durable, transferable, reviewable. He made it possible for someone, centuries later, to sit by a ruined shrine, brush dust off a tablet and say, "Ah, so this is what they once had." The last ledger. In an unremarkable museum storeroom in modern-day Athens, there exists a humble artifact, a lead tablet, roughly hand-sized, cracked at one corner. Its markings are simple, a short list. 2 amphorae of oil. 1 sacrificial bowl. 7 portions of barley. Hermes scratched faintly at the bottom. It isn't signed, it isn't dated. But it's estimated to be from the 3rd century BCE, likely one of the last surviving inventory slips from a now-forgotten countryside shrine. Whoever wrote it likely didn't think they were making history. They were just doing their job, marking what was there, and by extension, what wasn't. But that little tablet, unremarkable and nearly illegible, has survived longer than any prayer uttered in that shrine. And that, perhaps, is the final lesson of Hermes' log. Final reflection. Not all legacies are loud, not all innovations gleam. Some are carved into stone with dull tools. Some are made of pebble rows on dusty ground. Some are scribbled in haste before fleeing rising tides. But they endure. Because memory, once made visible, becomes more than recollection. It becomes record. And long after the gods themselves faded, Their lists kept whispering, one inventory at a time. Story 3. Aphrodite's skincare routine, olive oil and salt. You are walking down a narrow stone corridor, the air thick with incense and the scent of crushed herbs. The corridor leads to a chamber modest, sunlit, with a wide bronze basin and stacks of amphorae along the wall. There are no priests here, no supplicants, just shelves lined with alabaster jars, brushes, polished shells, and flasks. This is a beauty room, and according to legend, it belonged to Aphrodite. But not the Aphrodite of thunderous love or battlefield chaos, not the smiting temptress who sparked the Trojan War. No, this is the mourning Aphrodite, the quiet goddess of bodily rituals, skin maintenance, and the eternal struggle of olive oil stains on tunics. In this section, we peel back the veil of glamour to explore the dull but deeply significant routines that surrounded the goddess of beauty. Because even the divine needed exfoliation. A divine face requires daily maintenance. In ancient Greek texts, Aphrodite is often described as golden, radiant, or as luminous as polished marble. But few stories detail how such radiance was maintained. A fragment from the Hesiodic minor hymns, barely a dozen lines long, makes a fleeting reference. She rose in dawn's glow, bathed in oil drawn from the Peloponnesian groves, and passed a sea sponge over shoulder and heel. This is not a metaphor. Ancient temple records and domestic inventories suggest that rituals of cleansing and beautification were not spontaneous, but structured. Particularly in Aphrodite's cults, grooming was considered a sacred act, an emulation of the goddess herself. And so her routine became a model, not dramatic, not divine in spectacle, but carefully constructed from ordinary materials. The ingredients: olive oil, salt, and ash. 3 ingredients dominated the beauty routines in Aphrodite's shrines and among her priestesses. Olive oil, used not only for moisturizing but as a cleanser. In an era without soap, olive oil was applied to skin and scraped off with a strigil, a curved metal tool, removing dirt and sweat. Sea salt, ground into fine grains and mixed with oil to form a scrub. It served as a mild exfoliant, useful for softening skin and possibly reducing blemishes. Ash, charcoal, or fine ash from burned herbs was used as a base for some pastes. When mixed with oil, it created a kind of primitive cleansing mask. 1/4th century BCE instruction tablet from a temple in Cythera reads, "For the hands, oil twice passed; for the feet, oil and salt rubbed counterwise; for the face, ash of laurel set in still water then mixed." This isn't mythology, it's cosmetic chemistry. And it reflects a culture where bodily care was not vanity, it was veneration. The ritual of cleansing as worship. In temples devoted to Aphrodite, particularly those in Corinth and Paphos, mourning rituals often began not with hymns but with bathing. Young women assigned to the temple known as kurai were tasked with preparing the basin, warming the oil, often by placing sealed pots in sunlit alcoves, and mixing the salt scrub in shallow bowls. These were not offerings for the goddess, but actions in her image. By cleansing themselves, worshippers aligned with Aphrodite's ideals of order, care, and readiness. The cleaned body became a mirror of the goddess, beauty a state not inherited, but achieved through diligence. In fact, inscriptions from Aphrodite's sanctuary in Amathus refer to clean skin as truth of the surface. In their worldview, external clarity reflected internal harmony. It wasn't about seduction, it was about preparedness. Aphrodite's priestly tools. Some temples maintained dedicated cosmetic kits for sacred use. These kits, often stored in elaborately painted boxes, included bronze strigils for oil cleansing, shell spoons for scooping salt, soft brushes made from woven reeds or animal hair, pumice stones imported from Nisiros and used for smoothing skin, A remarkably well-preserved box discovered in Delos contained labeled compartments. Salt coarse for soles, oil soft press for face, ash laurel for neck, water sacred for final rinse. What this shows is not just attention to skin, but specialization. Each body part had its method, each step had its place. And every act, however dull, was a form of offering. A goddess mirror, reflection as ritual. The bronze mirror held a central place in Aphrodite's lore, but not simply as a symbol of vanity. In her cult, the act of looking at oneself was considered revelatory. Temple murals show women seated before polished bronze discs, hair tied back, eyes focused. This wasn't performance, it was inspection. To examine the face was to confront its changes, its truths. And in that reflection, there was a question. Is this the surface the goddess sees? According to ritual scrolls from the sanctuary in Knidos, priestesses were instructed to hold a mirror after cleansing and recite, "May the oil smooth. May the salt lift. May the truth remain." It's not a spell, it's skincare philosophy. And remarkably, it has survived, albeit in disguised form. Today's beauty routines, with their serums, exfoliants, and reflections, echo that same moment. A pause before the day begins, a small private claim to order. Aphrodite's real secret, repetition. Perhaps the most forgotten aspect of Aphrodite's beauty was its routine. She didn't wake radiant by divine right. She maintained radiance through daily effort every day, same steps, same tools. This consistency is echoed in household guides from the 3rd century BCE, where women's daily tasks are listed alongside prayers. Grind grain, feed children, oil arms, wash hair, offer figs. Beauty for Aphrodite wasn't transformation, it was maintenance. And maintenance, as any temple clerk or tired priestess could tell you, was boring. But in that boredom was power. The influence spreads. The cult of Aphrodite influenced not just sacred spaces, but homes, workshops, and even military encampments. Greek soldiers, especially officers, often carried small grooming kits. These included a flask of oil, a rough sponge, a small mirror. Why? Because cleanliness was associated with composure, and composure was Aphrodite's domain. One mercenary letter fragment, found near Alexandria, includes this line: "We bathed with the goddess rules, Nyctas lost his sponge." Even in war, the goddess of love made herself known not with seduction, but with a reminder: take care of yourself. Closing thought. Aphrodite's true power was not in how she appeared, but in how she prepared. She was not a goddess of spectacle, but of habits, repetitive, unremarkable, deeply personal actions that, when stacked day after day, became something divine. So the next time you wash your face, rub in a little oil, or examine your skin in the mirror, know this: you are not indulging. You are participating in an ancient, sacred ritual of attention. One that began with a goddess, a handful of salt, and a bronze mirror. You are in the courtyard of a temple in Cyprus. The morning sun is climbing slowly, and a group of women, all barefoot, all dressed in clean linen, are seated in a semicircle beneath a trellis of vines. Before each of them is a small clay pot, some filled with thick, honey-colored oil, others with a fine powder, nearly white. No one speaks. They are waiting for heat, for absorption, for the sacred interval between cleansing and scenting. These women are not idle. They are priestesses of Aphrodite. And this moment of pause between the routines of skin care and the application of fragrance is one of the most underestimated rituals in Greek religion. Because to smell like Aphrodite subtly, consistently, recognizably was as important as what you wore or how you prayed, possibly more so. In this section, we step deeper into the tactile world of ancient beauty, into jars, recipes, temple kitchens, and the slow, boring miracle of not smelling like a goat in the Mediterranean sun. Cleanliness was only the first step. Greek society placed a high value on appearance, but cleanliness alone was never enough. You needed fragrance, not strong perfume but controlled, layered scent. After cleansing the skin with oil, salt, or ash, the next step was neutralization. Body odor, left untreated in the warm climate of the Aegean, would easily overwhelm even the finest oils. Priestesses had a term for this moment: apochoresis to hydrota, departure of the sweat. And once the sweat had departed, scent was allowed to enter. Aphrodite's scent profile, a temple recipe. Temple inventories and medical treatises from the 4th century BCE preserve many recipes for scented oil blends. But the ones used in Aphrodite's cult were unique, deliberately mild, intended for close encounters rather than public display. One scroll fragment from Amethyst lists: pressed myrtle leaves soaked in warm olive oil for 3 days. Rose petals crushed, then wrapped in linen and steeped. A drop of honey wine to bind and slightly ferment the blend. Frankincense ash sifted and stirred in at the end. The result was described as a scent like warmed skin after sleep, touched by dew and sun. This wasn't perfume as a lure. It was olfactory philosophy, a controlled statement of presence. Not here I am, but if you're close enough to smell me, you're close enough to see me. The sacred smell of order. In Aphrodite's temples, scent wasn't just for the body, it was used to mark space. Entryways were dabbed with diluted myrtle oil. Curtain cords were dusted with rose powder. Offering altars were washed with scented water before dawn rites. According to temple procedure tablets from Cythera, the order of operations each morning was: clean the altar with spring water, oil the priestess's arms and faces, dust the ceremonial steps with rose powder, burn a myrtle branch for scent in the air. The goal was consistency. The smell of a temple of Aphrodite was not overpowering. It was predictable. Every morning the same balance, every evening the same retreat. And it made the goddess's spaces feel different from ordinary places. Not more grand, just more tended. The priestesses and their potions. Being a priestess of Aphrodite was not about standing at altars. It was about routine preparation. The most senior priestess, often called the aromakura, was in charge of managing the stock of ingredients used in skin and scent rituals. She maintained a log of jars used and refilled, a calendar for steeping herbs, a record of any blend that caused skin irritation. Yes, even goddesses need patch tests. Temple kitchens functioned more like apothecaries. Pots of oil were stored in cool stone niches. Dried petals were crushed with mortar and pestle, mixed with charcoal powder to preserve their scent. Linen cloths were used to strain and wrap ingredients. Everything was logged, labeled, and smelled before use. One recovered pot from Corinth, labeled simply Rho Omicron Delta Omicron U, rose, still held faint traces of scent centuries later. Modern chemical analysis found traces of geraniol from rose, myristicin from nutmeg, olive lipid residue. It smelled faintly sweet, mildly woody, more skin than flower. And that was the point. Scent and social structure. While scent was sacred within Aphrodite's temples, it also marked status outside them. In wealthier households, women emulated the goddess's routine, but not all oils were equal. Commoners used straight olive oil with a lemon peel. Merchants added powdered herbs to cover the scent of travel. Priestesses and elites used blended oils steeped for days or weeks. Interestingly, women of lower classes often lacked scent entirely, or used vinegar scrubs as a cheaper cleansing method. This created a quiet but clear olfactory hierarchy. If you smelled like roses and myrtle, you were likely connected to a temple. If you smelled like sweat and vinegar, you were not. Smell became a form of invisible clothing, a way to carry divinity, or the illusion of it, on the body. The politics of fragrance. Aphrodite's worship wasn't without controversy. In some cities, her rituals were tied fairly or unfairly to prostitution, due to the focus on women's bodies, grooming, and beauty. This perception made scent political. In Athens, for example, a 5th century decree, recorded in part on the stone Prytanean stele, banned certain temple oils from being worn in civic gatherings, under the accusation of distracting or softening the judgment of men. One commentator noted, "A man who smells myrtle forgets war." And so fragrance, in the name of Aphrodite, became a threat to masculine order. This only increased the reverence of scent in female spaces where it was not performance, but protection, a way to reclaim the body from judgment and align it with divine order instead. Scent in transition, the goddess fades, the rituals stay. By the Hellenistic era, as Roman influence spread and older cults weakened, Aphrodite's temples diminished, but the routines endured. Women still bathed with salt scrubs, applied oils steeped in herbs, smelled their skin each morning before dressing. These practices weren't prayers anymore, they were habits. One Roman satirist, Juvenal, mocked Greek women for rubbing more myrtle into their arms than prayers into the gods, but even he acknowledged their consistency. In this sense, Aphrodite achieved something rare. Her rituals outlasted her worship. Because tending to the body, checking for scent, and preparing the skin for touch or gaze, those became human actions, not divine ones. And they never stopped. Closing thought. Aphrodite's priestesses weren't perfumers, they were guardians of subtlety. Their daily work, mixing, warming, applying, waiting, wasn't about allure, it was about intention, a way to say, "I control how I am sensed, I choose what enters the air around me." In a world of chaos, warfare, politics, and noise, that small choice, how one smells, became a form of stability. So when you choose a lotion, dab perfume, or lean into a scent that feels like you, know this. You are practicing a rite as old as temples. And someone, somewhere, is standing close enough to notice. The goddess is no longer worshipped. Her temples are cracked, her altars overgrown. Her statues, once adorned with wreaths and rose oil, now rest in the silent corners of museums. And yet she lingers, not in marble but in motion. Because Aphrodite's most lasting legacy was not divine beauty, or the chaos of love, or the wars sparked by her smile. It was routine. We trace how the slow, dull mechanics of beauty cleansing, scenting, inspecting, maintaining quietly evolved from sacred acts into acts of survival, passed through generations long after the goddess faded from the prayers of mortals. This is the story of how beauty became memory, the forgotten continuation of care. When the cults of Aphrodite were suppressed, their rituals did not vanish, they drifted. Some were absorbed into early Roman household practices. Others survived in the grooming routines of courtesans and midwives. Still others were kept alive by herbalists and mothers, who never thought of themselves as priestesses, but repeated the goddess's rites without realizing. In rural Thrace, a 1st century CE burial revealed a woman interred with a small mirror, a pumice stone, a cloth pouch of dried herbs, and a sealed jar of oil. No religious symbols were found. Just these objects, personal, practical, and perfectly familiar to anyone in Aphrodite's service a century earlier. There was no temple, no cult, only the preservation of the body in death as in life. The rise of medical beauty. Greek medicine, especially the works of Hippocrates and Galen, eventually adopted many of Aphrodite's practices, reframing them in clinical language. Salt scrubs became treatments for excess surface heat. Olive oil was classified as a topical emollient for dry or inflamed skin. Laurel ash mixed with vinegar was recommended to balance humors and prevent rashes. In other words, divine beauty became prescribed behavior. One Hippocratic fragment even notes, "A woman who tends to her skin daily reduces melancholia and restores balance to her temperament." This wasn't vanity, it was self-regulation, a health regimen cloaked in the language of medicine, but drawn almost entirely from Aphrodite's old rituals. In times of hardship, beauty becomes control. Fast forward to the late Roman Empire and beyond. Civil war, famine, plague. The fragility of civilization revealed itself over and over. And yet, in the margins of disaster, personal grooming persisted. Letters from Roman Gaul include complaints from husbands away at war. Tell her to stop heating oil each morning. There is no need to smell like a flower in a burning city. But the women did it anyway. Why? Because routine creates structure. Structure builds calm, and calm, especially in hardship, is a form of resistance. To an outsider, oiling one's skin while the world burns may seem frivolous. To the one doing it, it's a whispered promise. I am still here. I still decide how I move through the world. Aphrodite would have understood. The invention of the mirror ritual. By the medieval period, direct references to Greek goddesses had all but disappeared in public discourse. But one practice endured, quietly passed from woman to woman, house to house. Wash the face. Apply oil. Check the mirror not to admire, but to see what changed. This moment, short and private, became a kind of secular divination, a way of taking stock. In some Byzantine homes, small poems were etched into the backs of mirrors. One reads, "The face today tells the tale of yesterday. Oil it gently and begin again." Another, "Skin remembers what words forget." These were not Aphrodite's words, but they carried her meaning. Not beauty for others, beauty as continuity. Aphrodite and the gender of repetition. Aphrodite's legacy reveals something that ancient histories often overlook. The labor of maintenance, repetitive, invisible, and essential, has always been gendered. Her routines were daily, quiet, non-spectacular, assigned almost exclusively to women. And yet they shaped everything. How people perceived one another, how they managed illness, how they prepared for ceremony, childbirth, mourning. Where male gods ruled through spectacle, Aphrodite ruled through ritual repetition. In this way, she became the goddess of things that didn't change, of habits too boring to record, of actions too small to make into myth but too necessary to lose. Aphrodite without altars. Today, we don't burn myrtle branches or mix rose petals with ash in temple kitchens, but we moisturize after a shower, sniff our wrists to check perfume, run a finger under our eyes in the mirror each morning, sit in silence with a cotton pad and the same bottle of toner as yesterday. We know it's not exciting, that's the point. We do it anyway. Not to be noticed, not to seduce, but because somewhere inside we know that care, especially when no one's watching, is a kind of quiet prayer. Aphrodite no longer demands worship. She simply waits at the edge of the mirror, present in the boring, blessed act of continuation. Final reflection. When we imagine goddesses, we think of thunder, lightning, golden crowns. But Aphrodite's real power lay elsewhere. In the third rinse. In the perfect balance of oil and salt. In the daily choice to smooth a face that the world had tried to wrinkle with worry. Her immortality was not in her name, but in her habits. So the next time you repeat a boring beauty task, wipe, scrub, pat, rinse, know that you are keeping something alive. Not a temple, not a myth, but a ritual older than marble and more lasting than fame. The care of the self, done slowly, done daily, done well. Story 4. How Athena taught bureaucracy to the Athenians. You are standing on the rocky slopes of the Acropolis before the city even has a name. There are no marbled columns, no democracy, no orators, just dust, stone, and a small contest about to unfold between two gods. You likely know the myth. Athena and Poseidon vied for the patronage of the city to be. Poseidon struck the earth and brought forth a salt spring or a horse, depending on the version. Athena, in contrast, planted an olive tree. This myth is often reduced to a symbol war versus wisdom, sea versus land. But something else happened that day, something bureaucratic. Because after Athena won, she didn't leave. She stayed. And she started asking questions. How many olives does this tree produce each year? How much land does the city have? How will we divide it? Who's responsible for irrigation? Where are the tools stored? And with those questions, bureaucracy, slow, deliberate, endlessly documented, was born. The goddess of strategy, not spontaneity. Athena wasn't a goddess of impulse, she was a planner. She was born fully formed and armored. She carried a shield with a face on it, precaution, as identity. She gave mortals tools and training, not feasts or destruction. So when the Athenians accepted her as their patron, she responded not with spectacle, but with organization. Her gift, the olive tree, was not just symbolic. It was practical, it gave. Oil for light-skinned trade. Wood for tools and homes. Leaves for ritual decoration and bedding. But these benefits required coordination. Trees needed care. Oil needed pressing. Pressing required tools, and tools needed maintenance. Athena, standing beneath her olive tree, introduced something entirely new to civic life: a management structure. The first inventory of the first tree. A fragment of early Athenian oral tradition, preserved awkwardly in a later Roman commentary records that Athena insisted on a recording of the tree. The process involved measuring the olive's growth, assigning a guardian, the morphophylax, literally shape watcher, documenting the first pressing, creating a public record. A line, likely recited ceremonially, reads, "Let it be known that the tree gives, and the people remember." This, more than the tree itself, was Athena's true gift: systemic memory, a city that remembers what it owns. And thus, the first civic register was born, not for soldiers or oracles, but for fruit yield. Organizing the sacred, temples as logbooks. With Athena came the expectation that sacred spaces be organized. Her temples became as much repositories of records as of prayer. The Parthenon, for example, housed massive inventories of gold and ivory, itemized, weighed, and reassessed annually. Temple stewards were required to submit tallies of offerings and equipment. Marble inscriptions from the 5th century BCE list exact quantities of incense, oil, and sacrificial animals. In one stele preserved in Athens' Epigraphical Museum, we find 24 amphorae of oil, 15 for ritual, 5 stored, 4 spilled, accounted by Naucles, third clerk of temple stores. This isn't poetry, it's administrative honesty. Athena's worship demanded clarity. You didn't just give, you tracked what was given. The origin of red tape, strings, seals, and scrutiny. The term red tape comes from much later history, but its spirit lived in classical Athens. To prevent tampering, Athena's clerks used colored cords and wax seals to secure scrolls, storage jars, toolboxes, even the doors to certain storerooms. Tampering with a seal without approval was not a minor offense. It was a crime against the city, a sacrilege against Athena. One surviving complaint, carved into a public grievance tablet from the 4th century BCE, accuses a junior clerk of breaking the wax of the oil store before festival preparation, and failing to return the red cord. No fire, no battle, just misplaced cord. But in Athena's Athens, that mattered. The rise of roles and reports. Athena's influence turned Athenian society into a web of official positions. Agoranomoi, market inspectors. Psittophylax, grain wardens. Logistai, financial auditors. Tamiai, temple treasurers. Each of these roles came with specific duties, record-keeping obligations, annual reporting requirements often engraved in stone and posted in public. Why stone? Because parchment fades, stone lasts. One such stone, dated to 418 BCE, lists the names of 6 men responsible for overseeing grain imports. It includes how many ships arrived, the volume of grain, and what portion was diverted to emergency reserves. This is not drama. This is disaster prevention written down, made public, overseen by Athena. Bureaucracy as civic identity. By the classical period, bureaucracy wasn't just a tool, it became a value. Young boys studied rhetoric, yes, but also basic accounting. They learned to calculate weights, measure field plots, and read civic inscriptions. Citizenship required military service, jury duty, and increasingly, an understanding of procedures. To participate in Athenian life was to engage with form, schedules, audits. This wasn't seen as a burden, not yet. It was proof of civilization. In fact, the term cosmos, often used for order or beauty, also came to imply administrative harmony. Athena was not just the goddess of war and wisdom. She was the goddess of standard operating procedures. When systems go wrong, of course systems fail. One late inscription, now half-worn, records a dispute in 410 BCE where temple grain records didn't match inventory. The cause? A missing decimal point in an oil measure. The mistake led to shortages during a festival, a priest's resignation, a new rule requiring debelenty recording. From then on, all major religious stores were counted twice, once by the Tamias and again by an independent overseer known as the episkopos. This redundancy, boring, slow, tedious, was not Athena's punishment. It was her lesson. Don't trust memory, trust the process. Closing thought. As the olive tree still stands gnarled and ancient on the Acropolis, it is easy to forget that it was never just a gift. It was a test. A challenge to manage, to monitor, to maintain. Athena's wisdom was never about what you knew. It was about how you structured the known. So the next time you fill out a form, count inventory, or follow a checklist, know this. You are working in the shadow of the goddess. And somewhere in the quiet groves of history, an olive tree is still being counted. The sun rises over ancient Athens, casting light across the white marble columns of the Parthenon. Markets stir to life, jurors gather, and temple attendants begin their daily inventories. But away from the action behind doorways, beneath shaded colonnades, something quieter is happening. Clerks are writing. One scratches figures into a wax tablet with a stylus. Another balances tallies with an abacus. A third rolls up a scroll, seals it, and stores it in a clay tube labeled with a god's name, a date, and the word Tamiai, treasurer. They do not wear wreaths, they do not speak loudly, but without them the city stops. This is the bureaucratic backbone of Athens, slow, uncelebrated, unchanging. And it is entirely Athena's doing. Bureaucracy as a civic virtue. In Athens, under Athena's patronage, administration wasn't just a necessary evil, it was a form of piety. Order was divine. To keep accurate records was to honor the goddess. This wasn't metaphorical. On Athena's festivals, particularly the Panathenaea, before any sacrifices were made or odes were sung, The first ritual act was administrative, reading the year's civic accounts aloud, displaying inventories of temple goods on inscribed stone slabs, publicly thanking treasurers for a year of faithful tabulation. Imagine a city so structured that its holiest moments began with a financial review. That's not legend, that's history. The clerks of Athena, quiet priests of process. We don't know many of their names, but we know their roles. Tamii managed temple finances and festival budgets. Anagraphes recorded laws and official proclamations. Grammates, general scribes, responsible for copying, checking, filing. Epimeletai oversaw public works and construction projects. Catalogies, catalogers of everything from citizens to sacred vessels. These roles were not glamorous. In fact, they were considered a kind of service penance, but they carried enormous responsibility. One mistake could misallocate festival funds. Another could send too few rations to a garrison. Even small clerical errors could trigger audits or worse, public ridicule during assembly debates. Athena didn't strike down sloppy clerks, the demos did. Writing as ritual. Much of the clerks' work was manual. Wax tablets for temporary figures. Papyrus scrolls for correspondence. Ostraka pottery shards for public ballots or short-term notices. Stone inscriptions for final, permanent records. Each step had a purpose. Draft it. Review it. Recopy it. Inscribe it. This process, tedious and easily mocked, was the city's lifeline. It allowed checks and balances, evidence in disputes, transfers of knowledge between generations. In Athena's world, writing wasn't performance, it was insurance. Bureaucracy in stone. Unlike modern filing cabinets, Athens had no centralized archives, but the Athenians had something better: stone. Decrees, inventories, court decisions, and tax assessments were etched into marble or limestone and placed in designated public spaces, particularly in the Stoa Basileos, Royal Stoa, and the Bouleuterian Council House. Examples include grain import quotas, oath formulas for magistrates, lists of sacred vessels housed in the Parthenon, one stele from the 430s BCE lists, 324 shields held in readiness, 30 damaged, 4 missing reported by Ariston. This was not myth-making, it was resource management. If Athena was the goddess of wisdom, stone inscriptions were her paper trail. Redundancy as design. Athena's systems were not efficient by modern standards, but they were resilient. Every important document was copied multiple times, stored in different locations, cross-checked by multiple clerks. A record of tax obligations might appear in a magistrate's scroll, on a stone at the agora, as a carved notice at the entrance of the relevant deemed district. This layering wasn't wasteful. It was a safeguard against forgetfulness, fraud, and fire. Athena didn't trust memory, she trusted method. When the system fails, a case study in olive oil mismanagement. A fragmentary court record from the 4th century BCE tells the story of Dionysoteros, a storage clerk accused of underreporting temple oil reserves. The audit revealed 40 amphorae missing. No record of distribution. Discrepancies across 2 ledgers. The investigation took weeks, involving testimony from junior clerks, reconciliation with tax records, physical recounting of jars stored in the Acropolis Annex. In the end, Dionysoteros was exonerated, but the affair led to a new protocol. Henceforth, all sacred stores shall be counted thrice yearly, by 2 tamii and 1 episkopos, reports to be filed no more than 10 days following the count. This wasn't drama, it was policy evolution. Athena didn't shout, she amended procedure. The clerk's tools, unseen instruments of the state. Archaeological digs near the Pnyx and the Athenian Agora have uncovered dozens of writing tools, some simple, others surprisingly complex. Styluses with dual tips, one for writing, the other for erasing on wax. Bone tally counters with carved notches. Wooden box abacuses lined with small pebbles. Sealing stamps bearing names like Aeschines, Grammatius, or Property of the Demos. Each object represents a hand that wrote, not ruled. These weren't leaders, they were maintainers. And in Athena's worldview, that was divine work. Bureaucracy as democracy. Athens' famed democracy wasn't just about open debate, it was about open records. Any citizen could inspect treasury accounts. Anyone could read decrees posted in the Agora. Court decisions were published and reviewed. This transparency required bureaucratic machinery, a network of scribes and archivists who ensured that democracy had a memory. Without these records, laws became guesses. Property disputes became blood feuds. Festival budgets turned to rumors. Athena ensured that no civic act existed without documentation. Boredom with purpose. To outsiders, this level of record-keeping might have seemed excessive. Even some Athenians mocked it. The playwright Aristophanes in The Wasps jokes about a character who keeps ledgers for his chickens and writes decrees for his shoes. But beneath the humor was a respect for civic order. The joke lands because everyone knew the system mattered, even if it was slow. Athena never promised speed, she promised stability. Closing thought. We remember Athena as a goddess of war strategy and noble ideals, but her real gift was something quieter. A scroll double-checked. A stone inscription, weathered but legible. A shelf in a storeroom, labeled and counted. She didn't win cities through glory, she kept them running. So the next time you groan at paperwork, or dread updating a spreadsheet, or double-check a number in a report, pause. You're doing Athenian work. And in those dull, deliberate motions, you echo a goddess who believed that wisdom was not brilliance, but structure that endures. Athenian bureaucracy did not collapse with the fall of Athens. Like the olive tree on the Acropolis, weather-beaten, gnarled, but still alive, it persisted. It shifted, adapted, changed script, changed medium, but its essence, the slow, deliberate structure of administration, remained. Because once something is written down, it's harder to forget, harder to deny, harder to undo. We follow Athena's bureaucratic legacy beyond myth and polis, into empires, law codes, libraries, and the whispering echo of paper rustling in stone rooms. Bureaucracy beyond Athens, the imperial echo. As Athens declined, the systems Athena inspired were borrowed, adopted, and expanded by those who followed. The Macedonians under Alexander used Athenian record-keeping to track conquests, supply routes, and coinage circulation across a vast empire. The Ptolemies in Egypt developed a hybrid bureaucracy, Greek in structure, Egyptian in depth. They maintained lists of livestock, land use, grain storage, and even personal appearance permits. The Romans, ever pragmatic, expanded the Athenian habit of civic documentation into a sprawling empire of ledgers, scroll rooms, tabularia, and stamped seals. By the 1st century BCE, record-keeping had become power. To rule a province was not simply to collect tribute or enforce law, it was to keep accurate files. Athena's legacy had outgrown temples. It had become an infrastructure. From stone to scroll to archive. The medium changed. Stone gave way to papyrus. Papyrus to parchment. Parchment to codices. But the principal recording for permanence remained unchanged. One Roman official in Alexandria, c. 90 CE, complained. The scribes keep better track of the census roles than I do of my own children. It was not meant as a joke. Administrators had assistants whose sole duty was to cross-reference records. This meant that, for example, tax payments were logged 3 times. Grain exports required 5 seals. Festival costs required reports from both the temple and the governor's office. Annoying, yes. Resilient, absolutely. The bureaucrat as priest of order. By the Byzantine era, many clerks carried both civic and religious titles. They weren't just administrators, they were considered custodians of divine order. They copied scripture, filed marriage decrees, archived property claims, preserved tax law alongside sacred doctrine. The boundaries between divine and civil vanished, just as they had in Athens. A 6th century clerk in Constantinople, Stephanos the Meticulous, was famous not for sermons or visions, but for never losing a document in 40 years. When he died, he was buried with his stylus. The inscription read, "He wrote what was, and let nothing be lost." The invisible legacy in daily life. By the time we reached the medieval period, few remembered Athena's name outside libraries, but her systems were still there. In land records carved onto wooden slats in monasteries, in grain inventories held by port authorities, in hospital logs that recorded which monks received which herbs. Even in the so-called dark centuries, people still counted, filed, cross-checked, because the loss of myth is not the loss of method. Athena was no longer invoked, but she was still followed. The birth of the clerk's desk. Eventually, bureaucracy moved indoors. Offices replaced agoras. Cabinets replaced public walls. The desk replaced the scroll stand. And yet, the shape of the work remained the same. Line after line. Tally after tally. A quiet commitment to knowing where things are. The clerks became invisible, but they were everywhere. One 14th century Venetian merchant manual includes a curious line. The soul of a shop is not the owner, it is the ledger. This could have been written in Athens, 1,800 years earlier. The divine is in the details. Athena, if she still watched, would not have needed worship to feel seen. She would have watched a low-level shipping clerk in Rhodes reconciling missing cargo, a scribe in Antioch adjusting a tax rate after drought, a woman in Crete copying herb inventories for winter medicine. None of them called it sacred, but every one of them was performing an act of structured wisdom. And that was her domain. A very small, very persistent idea. What makes bureaucracy powerful isn't that it's exciting, it's that it lasts. It's repetitive, boring, standardized, which makes it stable. While kings fall and temples burn, systems survive, ledgers survive, records, though fragile, outlive noise. This was Athena's gift. An olive tree that gives again every year, a system that works even when the people forget why. The olive tree still stands. Today, there's a tree on the Acropolis, said to be descended from Athena's original gift. Whether that's true doesn't matter. What matters is that someone keeps track of the tree's age, its yield, its preservation, and that someone logs it, files it, perhaps reports it in a boring committee meeting. That act, unremarkable as it seems, is the continuation of a sacred order. Final reflection. Bureaucracy is rarely heroic. It doesn't storm beaches or move hearts. But it holds together what chaos tries to scatter. Athena understood this. Her gift to Athens was not just the olive or the spear, but the system behind them. The rule book, the schedule, the form that must be filed by the third moon, signed by 2 witnesses and recorded in stone. That's not divine theater, that's civilization. So the next time you find yourself in line at the DMV, lost in the weeds of an Excel spreadsheet, or muttering about missing receipts, pause for a moment. You are participating in a lineage that began with a goddess under an olive tree, asking, "Who's responsible for the olives?" and making sure the answer got written down. Story 5. The time Hera micromanaged a temple renovation. The town of Argus is quiet in the early morning. You can hear the clatter of carts delivering limestone. A foreman argues softly with a mason over the thickness of a column base. There are blueprints wax tablets and tallies of stone blocks stacked in orderly rows. And standing just outside the main construction site, arms crossed, brows furrowed, is a goddess. Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, protector of marriage and childbirth, and as it turns out, an absolute nightmare on construction projects. This is the story of how Hera, patron deity of Argus, turned a modest temple renovation into a masterclass in divine micromanagement, cost overruns, delayed timelines, and the invention of something modern city planners now know all too well: the punch list. Hera's temples were never simple. Of all the Olympians, Hera was among the most frequently worshipped in formal temple structures. Her sanctuaries dotted the Greek world, with major temples in Argus, Samos, Olympia, and Pericora. Her devotees were largely responsible for marriage rites, domestic rituals, agricultural festivals tied to fertility and childbirth. This meant that her temples were busy, constantly in use, and therefore in constant need of upkeep. But Hera was not a distant goddess who smiled upon all offerings from afar. No, Hera visited her temples. And according to ancient commentary, she had opinions. The Argive renovation, a modest beginning. In the early 5th century BCE, the Heraean Temple of Hera, near Argus, underwent a scheduled renovation. Records inscribed on temple stone fragments suggest. New columns were to replace older wooden ones. Roof tiles were to be upgraded to terracotta. The altar was to be expanded to accommodate festival crowds. The budget, recorded by a temple steward named Lysidamos, was set at 9 talents of silver. Work was to last 3 seasons. But by the second month, everything slowed down. Why? Because the goddess started appearing in dreams. Divine oversight. Multiple surviving inscriptions refer to the visitations, visions or dreams that temple workers, especially stonemasons and overseers, claimed to receive from Hera. One worker's scratched note on a tablet reads, "She came again, said the stairs are too narrow, I'm to fix them before first light." Another, "Do not use the cheaper clay tiles, the goddess prefers marble edges." Were these dreams, prophecies, or just the collective anxiety of a workforce building under the gaze of a famously exacting deity? No one knows, but they took them seriously. And soon the renovation slowed to a crawl. Change orders from Olympus. The surviving construction logbook, known as the Stele of Hera's house, includes no fewer than 14 revisions to the original plan. Among them, a demand to replace all wooden doorframes with bronze, the addition of decorative friezes with marital symbolism, a last-minute expansion to the ritual bathing area, a refusal to allow lime plaster in certain sacred zones. Each change was inscribed with a short phrase, "as per the will of the goddess." This phrase became so common that later stewards abbreviated it as APWG, carving it like a bureaucratic rubber stamp into official ledgers. APWG, as per the will of the goddess. It meant don't ask questions, do the work. The first punch list. One of the more amusing fragments recovered from the Heraean is a list etched into a thin slab of slate. It is, in essence, a checklist. Column 3 capital reshaped. Drainage basin deepened. Bronze door hinge tightness rechecked. Decorative owl removed, deemed too Athenian. Oil lamp sconces realigned, as per dream. At the bottom, a scribbled note. If she shows up again, stall for time. This may be the first recorded punch list in architectural history, a to-do list of final corrections made not by architects, but by someone attempting to placate a divine client. The budget spirals. Unsurprisingly, the renovation went over budget. Local quarries ran dry. Imported marble had to be reordered. Bronze door hinges, mandated by divine vision, quadrupled costs. By the end of the second year, the 9-talent budget had become 13.4. To fund the gap, the priesthood introduced new fundraising methods. A special Hera's Renewal Festival with entry fees. Offering jars placed near popular market stalls. A proposed marriage tax never enforced, but carved in draft form into a small stele that still exists. One frustrated record keeper carved. She wants perfection, but perfection is expensive. The temple staff develop a system. To cope, the temple staff created a series of standard responses to anticipated divine meddling. These included the deferred affirmation. We hear the goddess's will. It will be implemented with the next budget cycle. The symbolic substitution. When the goddess demanded a costly marble upgrade, a thin plaster overlay with marble dust was applied and blessed instead. The strategic omission. That feature has been moved to the sacred inner register, a polite way of saying, we're pretending it's done. By the third year, these methods had become internal policy. They weren't lies, they were bureaucratic negotiations with divinity. Hera's silent approval. Eventually, the renovations were completed mostly. A final entry in the steward's log simply says, "She has not spoken for 20 nights." In temple politics, silence was divine satisfaction. The new Herion was larger, more beautiful, and significantly more expensive than planned. But it stood, and it served for centuries. And it bore the unmistakable mark of a project not built quickly, but correctly down to the hinge, the stair, and the base of every oil sconce. It was, in every sense, micromanaged into immortality. Closing thought. Hera is often remembered as vengeful, jealous, difficult. But in this renovation, she reveals something else. The desire for excellence, enforced through persistence. She didn't rage, she reviewed, she didn't destroy, she edited. So the next time you're asked to revise a plan for the third time, or find yourself stuck in a feedback loop with someone who just wants it slightly different, pause. You may be working with a Hera. And if you are take notes, keep records, smile politely. And remember, somewhere in Argus, a bronze door still creaks on a hinge she approved. You might imagine the ancient Greek world as ruled by warriors, philosophers, and gods. But in truth, much of it was managed by stonecutters, tile makers, water engineers, and clerks with sore hands, especially when the project in question involved a goddess who checked your work. As the second year of renovations at the Herion of Argus unfolded, the laborers and supervisors began to understand something important. This wasn't just a building project. It was a divine lesson in diligence, and perhaps also a punishment for hubris. The gods, as always, taught slowly through repetition, oversight, and long, boring days of correcting marble trim. Designed by deity. At the heart of the problem was this: Hera wasn't just a sponsor of the temple, she acted like its architect. The initial blueprints developed by mortal artisans and approved by the temple board were altered not once, but repeatedly, in response to dreams, omens, and priestly divinations. Several of the changes were oddly specific. The column spacing had to be no wider than a woman's stride. The statue base needed an odd-numbered height. Even numbers were deemed inauspicious. An originally planned skylight was removed, after an augur observed a crow land on the unfinished roof and caw only once. By year 2, the design team had stopped using the word final. The ritual of measuring, an unusual feature of the Argive renovation, was the ceremonial measuring ritual, instituted after a dream revealed to a priestess that the goddess watches every cubit. From that point forward, every major stone placement had to be ritually measured before final setting. A senior priest marked approved measurements with a red line of ochre. Any stone laid without the line had to be lifted and rechecked. Over time, the builders developed a kind of rhythm. Measure, present, bless, place. Slow incredibly, but the rhythm itself became a sacred routine and oddly calming. In later years, stonemasons trained at the Heraeon would bring this ritual with them to other cities, insisting on formal measuring ceremonies even in secular builds. The quiet inventiveness of frustrated laborers. When divine oversight is constant, workarounds become sacred acts in themselves. Faced with endless revisions and costly material demands, the project's builders began to innovate. Marble dust stucco, a thin blend of lime, marble dust, and pigment that created the appearance of pure marble at a fraction of the cost. Approved by the goddess after a cloudy dream. Hidden reinforcements. Columns too slender for new loads were quietly reinforced with bronze rods embedded deep inside. When asked, the builders said the goddess wishes them light and graceful, and left the engineering unsaid. Shifting altars. One of the side altars was relocated 5 times to align with shifting ritual expectations. Eventually, builders placed it on a rotating stone base, allowing for adjustments depending on the priest's interpretation of Hera's mood. These were not shortcuts. They were survival tactics in the face of theological perfectionism. The exhausted budget and the invented currency. By the start of year 3, the temple treasury was empty. A revised accounting stele preserved at the Argus Museum reveals how the priests, desperate to fund the final phase, introduced a localized temple token called the Herakion. This wasn't a full currency. It functioned more like a voucher, usable only at local vendors participating in the temple renovation. For materials, food, and labor. The vouchers bore Hera's face on one side and an image of a half-finished temple on the other. Vendors who accepted them could later redeem the tokens for partial silver payments, or, in some cases, festival privileges like seating or ritual offerings in their name. It was an early form of municipal scrip, born out of the pressure to complete a divine project on overdraft. Worker complaints, the papyrus whispers. A rare trove of worker complaint fragments, recovered from a clay jar near the laborers' barracks, provides a human voice to the divine saga. Third revision to stair height. Feet are tired. Goddess does not climb these stairs herself. No extra pay for night blessing. Mosquitoes. Priest coughed on the scroll. If I carve another dandelion into a frieze, I will lose all joy in flowers. There's humor, yes, but also fatigue, and yet not one entry suggests that the workers considered quitting. Because to walk off the job was to abandon a sacred commitment. And besides, Hera might notice. Sacred micromanagement becomes civic discipline. Over time, the rigorous procedures developed during the renovation filtered into local city governance. The priesthood began requiring formal inspections of civic buildings every 6 months, a 3-signature rule for approving treasury expenditures, public posting of completed construction specs so the goddess and the people may compare. In effect, Hera's renovation gave birth to Argive building codes. Future projects, even ones she didn't directly supervise, carried the same meticulous structure. Hera had taught a city how to build by teaching them how to endure endless revisions without descending into chaos. the final offering, a renovation of ritual. When the final block was placed, and the temple deemed complete, the priests declared a new annual festival, the epinorthosis, or the correction. Unlike other festivals of joy or thanksgiving, this one was quiet, reflective. Workers processed through the temple with their tools, now ceremonial. A recitation of every change order was read aloud, yes, all 14. An olive wreath was placed on the cornerstone Hera had allegedly rejected and later accepted. The message was clear: perfection is a process, not a state. And in that ritual, the goddess's relentless oversight found its meaning not as torment, but as a call to do better, again and again. Closing thought. Hera did not wield thunderbolts, she wielded standards. She didn't burn blueprints, she annotated them. And in doing so, she taught her followers a slow, steady truth: divinity may reside in the edits. So the next time you get notes on your work, or someone says just one more tweak, imagine the ghost of Hera in the room. Not angry, just deeply invested in getting it right. And remember, in Argus, under a roof built to her impossible standards, people still light lamps, still whisper vows, and still walk the stairs rebuilt 3 times without complaint. The temple stood at last. 3 years late, 4 talents over budget, with 14 official revisions and many more quietly undocumented. The Herion of Argus was finally declared, complete by both the priesthood and, more importantly, the goddess herself who, it was said, had not appeared in a dream for 40 nights. In Greek religion, absence was sometimes the only assurance you'd get. No omens, no corrections, just peace. The final column was rubbed with sacred oil. The revised friezes showing not just weddings and births, but also civic meetings and carpenters at work were hung with garlands. The work crews departed with aching arms and a new sense of what it meant to survive a project that involved a literal deity breathing down your neck. But Hera's presence didn't vanish. She remained not as a vision, but in the very systems and expectations her interference had carved into stone. A temple that taught the city. Once the renovation was complete, the Herion didn't just serve ritual functions. It became something more. A model of standardized construction practices for future civic buildings. A public ledger of work logs, inscriptions, and material tallies that future projects imitated. A symbol of persistent quality over rushed completion. Records from the city council, preserved in later inscriptions, show that all city-funded structures were now required to keep daily ledgers modeled after the Herion's dream record logs. Materials had to be pre-approved via ritual preview, in which stone and timber samples were presented at the altar before work began. A rotating committee of 3 temple veterans was tasked with overseeing public works not as priests, but as those who had worked under the eye of Hera. In other words, the goddess had accidentally created a school of construction discipline, born of micromanagement and hardened into culture. The priests become project managers. After the completion, the priesthood of Hera found their roles expanding. They weren't just keepers of ritual, they were managers of divine expectations, specialists in what we might call spiritual compliance. As a result, priests began training apprentices not only in liturgy, but in ledger keeping and inventory audits. Offerings had to be logged within 24 hours and reconciled weekly. Every tool used in a sacred context was tracked, marked with tiny clay tokens stamped with the temple's seal. A temple steward's tablet from 436 BCE notes: "We now train our priests with calipers and scales. The goddess is best served when measurements are honest." Here, devotion and data entry were not opposites, they were twins. Visitors from afar. What Hera had imposed through dreams and symbols, other cities soon admired through observation. Delegates from Epidaurus, Corinth, Mycenae, visited the Herion to view its structure. They took notes on the drainage system, the material substitutions, the plaque that listed all 14 design changes with commentary. These details weren't just curious, they were instructive. Over time, architects in other cities began mimicking the Herion's practices. Revision ledgers, material sample tables, a special storage room dedicated to post-completion adjustments. One temple builder in Boeotia even requested a Hera-trained stonemason, as if that were a certification. From frustration came a standard: micromanagement as memory. What survives of the renovation is fragmented bits of stone, clay tokens, incomplete inscriptions, but one document offers something rare: a retrospective. It's a stele commissioned decades later, marking the 30th anniversary of the temple's completion. Chiseled into its face are these words: to the goddess Hera, queen and builder, who taught us to measure not once but thrice, who corrected, who waited, who endured. May this temple remain stubborn and beautiful, as she is. What an odd mix of respect and fatigue. It captures what the workers likely felt at the time. She was impossible, but she was also right. And they would not forget the lessons. A lasting blueprint. The Herion of Argus became more than a structure. It became a procedural model. Later temples followed its template, not in form but in spirit. Detail before haste, clarity before completion, patience before presentation. And even as Greece's city-states waxed and waned, even as the gods fell silent under Roman rule and later Christian expansion, the habits of the Herion renovation persisted. Architectural treatises from the Roman period refer obliquely to the Argive method, a reference to process over form. They didn't always know they were following Hera, but they were. When the goddess steps back, strangely, Hera's most lasting act wasn't the correction she issued. It was her final silence. That absence when the dreams ceased, the visitations ended, and no more revisions arrived taught something profound. That completion is not perfection. That letting go is sometimes the last necessary step. That trust, once earned through diligence, allows the overseer to rest. Even the gods, it seems, must eventually sign off on the work and step aside. And perhaps that is what Hera did, not in anger or boredom, but in quiet satisfaction. The work was good. It bore her mark. It would last. Closing reflection. Temples crumble, stone weathers, dreams fade. But process endures. The micromanaging goddess of marriage taught her followers how to build, not with speed or flair, but with layers of care, each frustrating, each slow, and each absolutely necessary. And so, in the creak of a finished door, the slope of a corrected stair, and the careful etching of a correction log into cold marble, Hera lives. So the next time someone insists on one more round of edits, another inspection, a longer checklist, pause. They may not be a goddess, but they are perhaps doing her work. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the divine realm, Hera smiles. Not because it's perfect, but because it's finally done properly. Story 6. The invention of inventory management by Hestia's firekeepers. At the center of every ancient Greek home, temple, and city was a fire. Not a roaring blaze, just a steady glow. A coal bed carefully tended, fed with measured bits of olive wood or straw, watched, not worshipped, but never ignored. This was the sacred fire of Hestia, goddess of the hearth, of home, and of continuity. She was the firstborn of the Olympians, the least quarrelsome, and the only one who never left Mount Olympus. She was not dramatic. She did not meddle in wars or descend disguised to interrupt mortal lives. Instead, she burned, quietly, constantly. And around that fire, something essential emerged. The earliest practices of inventory management, the art of knowing what you have, what you've used, and what you'll need. A boring task, yes, but one that sustained households, temples, and even entire cities. This is the story of how the firekeepers of Hestia turned counting into continuity, and how civilization, in its quietest corners, depended on a goddess whose presence was so stable. People often forgot she was divine at all. Hestia, the goddess nobody argued with. There are no great myths about Hestia. No monsters slain in her name. No rivalries, no tragic romances. While the other Olympians thundered and schemed, Hestia simply stayed. In myth, she famously gave up her seat on the 12-throned council of Olympus so that Dionysus, god of revelry, could have a place. Her domain wasn't conquest, it was care. The home fire that boiled your lentils. The small altar in the back of a courtyard. The warmth that made a cold morning tolerable. And that hearth, it had needs. Wood, oil, ash cleaning, ember management. If left unattended, it would go out. If overfed, it would burn too hot. And so someone had to tend it, always. The firekeepers, more than wood stackers. In temples and some large households, there were dedicated firekeepers, often women, sometimes elderly men, occasionally slaves who were responsible for feeding the fire with exactly the right amount of fuel, collecting ash and discarding it ritually, monitoring burn rate to estimate future fuel needs, ensuring kindling, coals, and ceremonial oils were always stocked. It sounds mundane, but this small set of tasks required constant awareness. How much olive oil remained? When would the next wood delivery arrive? Did the current bundle of kindling burn faster than the last? Over time, the firekeepers began keeping records, not elaborate scrolls, but etched sticks, tied bundles, and colored pebbles. Each system was a way of saying, this much remains, this much has been used, this much must be gathered. It was, in essence, the beginning of inventory tracking. Tally sticks and token bundles. In a Herion or a household shrine, no one expected the firekeepers to be literate, but that didn't mean they weren't keeping count. Some of the earliest known inventory tools found in Greek domestic sites are tally sticks, short pieces of wood with notches indicating bundles of wood used per day. Pebble sets, small colored stones stored in a sequence, black for charcoal, red for fresh logs, white for ash removal days. Oil threads, strings with knots at specific intervals, used to measure remaining amphora levels by dipping and checking. None of these were writing, technically, but they served the same purpose, accountability through consistency. One elderly firekeeper in a 4th century BCE record was referred to as the one who never lost count. Her real name is lost, but her system kept the fire burning for 40 years. The ash ledger of Delos. On the island of Delos, sacred to Apollo and home to one of Hestia's major temples, archaeologists uncovered a fragment of what appears to be an ash ledger. It's a slab of stone, roughly carved, listing days of the month, amount of ash removed, measured in handfuls, name of the firekeeper on duty. There are no flowery prayers or mythic references, just practical data. And yet inscribed at the bottom, in slightly more elegant hand, let the ash be known, that the fire may not die. A quiet theology. To count the remains was to preserve the sacred. Inventory as ritual. In the temples that honored Hestia, inventory was not merely record-keeping. It became part of daily ritual. Morning rites included checking and reciting fuel stock levels aloud, lighting the fire only after confirming all supplies were present, pouring a measured amount of oil, no more, no less. Firekeeping became a discipline passed from elder to apprentice, always centered around the same questions. How much do we have? How much have we used? What must we gather next? When the answers were known, Hestia was said to be present. When they weren't, prayers were whispered not to bring fire, but to help remember what had been forgotten. The firekeeper's calendar. Over time, larger temples developed seasonal burn plans, noting how much wood was needed in summer versus winter, when wind made fires flicker dangerously, or when festival cooking would require extra fuel. These calendars included predicted use cycles, wood procurement schedules, olive oil rationing days, a calendar from Lucy's lists. Week 3, month of Anthesterion, double oil stores for the coming of the light ritual, reduce wood by half following festival. This wasn't myth. This was operations management, 2,400 years before the spreadsheet. And Hestia, though not named directly in these notes, hovered over them like steam rising from a well-tended kettle. No glory, just continuity. In a world of heroic myths, Hestia offered something humbler but far more necessary: continuity. She didn't save cities, she helped them not fall apart. When the storm howled, the hearth stayed warm. When food was scarce, the ration logs helped stretch it. When the gods argued, her temple remained untouched, always burning, always stocked, always steady. The firekeepers never sought honor, but they kept the wheels turning. And inventory, it wasn't a task, it was a form of prayer. To know what you had was to express gratitude. To track what you used was to accept responsibility. And to plan for what you needed was to express hope. Closing thought. In our modern world of barcodes and apps, we forget that counting began as a sacred act. Somewhere long ago, a woman sat beside a hearth, holding a bundle of kindling, and asked, "Will this be enough for tomorrow?" And that question, quiet, practical, sacred, was the start of a system that still burns today. So the next time you inventory your pantry, or check your calendar for supply runs, pause. You're keeping a fire alive. You're doing Hestia's work. Imagine a small, one-room household in 5th century BCE Athens. A family of 5 lives here. The father tends vines, the mother weaves cloth, the children fetch water, grind grain, feed chickens. But there is one person, often the eldest grandmother or a devoted servant, whose role remains constant, regardless of season, wealth, or the tides of fortune. The firekeeper. She doesn't just feed the flame. She ensures everything around the flame is in its proper place. This is not worship, this is procedure. And through her careful patterns of checking, sorting, rationing, and replenishing, the firekeeper brings into the home a principle more powerful than fortune: predictability. The fire as the center of planning. The hearth was not just symbolic in Greek homes, it was the literal center. Cooking took place there. Warmth emanated from it. Light came from it after sunset. Offerings to the gods were made through it. Everything else was planned around the needs of that fire. And this planning wasn't vague, it was measured. In households where firewood had to be purchased or gathered from limited commons, knowing how many logs would last the week was critical. If you overburned one night, the next day you might eat cold lentils, lose precious light for spinning or mending, miss your chance to offer morning incense to Hestia herself. So families learned to track burn rate, often using string knots or small scratch stones left beside the hearth, each representing a unit of wood used. Domestic logbooks without the writing. In wealthier homes, literate women or educated slaves sometimes kept simple ledgers. These weren't elegant scrolls or poetic records, they were clay tablets with scratched inventory counts, wax boards tallying daily oil usage, papyrus notes rolled and tied with kitchen twine, sample entries reconstructed from fragments. 6 logs consumed, 2 left, send boy to market by dusk. Olive oil, 1 amphora, 1 jug, high jug for winter stock. Ash level high, shovel tomorrow before bath ritual. This is inventory management, not in the marketplace but beside the coals, amid cooking pots, bundles of dried herbs and hanging ladles. Temple firekeeping, scaling the domestic. In Heshta's temples, the same domestic logic was scaled upward. Instead of one family, a firekeeper oversaw the needs of daily ritual fires, special festival bonfires, sacred cooking for votive meals, maintenance of torches for processions. That required monthly forecasting, coordination with delivery men, woodcutters and olive pressers, storage planning, wood in dry places, oil in clay amphorae marked by grade. Some temples even had rotating duty rosters, noted on tablets or carved wooden wheels, assigning daily roles. Ash collector, oil pourer, ember monitor. Each duty had a checklist. Each checklist was a form of reverence. Waste as a warning. For firekeepers, waste was not simply inconvenient, it was ominous. A fire that consumed more than expected meant the wood was too dry and burning too fast. Someone had fed it improperly. The schedule was being ignored. In temple and home alike, waste was marked. One household steel records. On the 6th, oil ran out at dusk, no flame at supper, omens red again, found the jug used early, girl reprimanded. This isn't cruelty, it's discipline in a fragile system. Fuel mismanagement could lead to ritual failure, public embarrassment, divine silence. And so, the careful watch of the fire became a moral act. The chain of replenishment. What firekeeping teaches is not just consumption, it teaches replenishment cycles. In the rhythms of hearth life, every item consumed must be tracked, anticipated, replaced. The firekeeper often kept a mental map of supply routes. Pine kindling from the south ridge. Olive oil from the pressing jars under the house. Fresh coals from the baker's oven on festival days. This was not logistics in a grand military sense, but it was logistics of daily survival. And in that way, the quiet rhythm of Heshta's domain mirrors the foundations of any complex system today. Consistency through foresight. When the fire went out, occasionally, despite all planning, a fire would die. Maybe a storm made wood too wet. Maybe someone forgot their duty. Maybe Heshta simply turned her gaze. Reigniting the hearth wasn't simple. In sacred spaces, it required a formal extinguishing ritual, clean ash removal, invocation of Heshta's name, relighting from a nearby sacred fire, often from another temple or central altar. This relighting event served as a reset and acknowledgement that even the most careful systems sometimes fail and must begin again. It also renewed the firekeeper's sense of purpose. To tend, track, and protect not for glory, but for continuity. The training of the next firekeeper. In both temple and household, knowledge of inventory was passed down carefully. Training involved shadowing an elder through morning fire checks, learning which pebbles meant which counts, practicing oil rationing during dry months. It was not glamorous, but it built habits, precision, patience, responsibility. In one preserved letter from a priestess in Delphi, she writes to her niece, "Remember, your job is not to keep the fire burning only, but to know what it eats and when. Fire is hunger. Your duty is to feed it wisely." This is inventory management as relationship. Closing thought. In the grand sweep of history, the names of firekeepers are mostly lost, but their systems remain. Every warehouse ledger, every reorder schedule, every low stock alert on a modern screen begins in a darkened room where someone held a small olive wood stick, counted their coals, and asked, Do we have enough for tomorrow? And by answering that question, again and again, they kept the world from falling into cold silence. The fire still burned, day after day, season after season, through political upheaval, market shortages, and even family tragedy. In the middle of it all, unmoving, silent and glowing, was Hesje's fire. But this fire wasn't just warmth or worship. It had become something more profound, a structuring force. Around it, daily routines were organized, inventories tracked, stores replenished. And through this long ritual of domestic discipline, society learned how to plan. The temple becomes an archive. In the great temples of Hestia in Delphi, in Olympia, and lesser-known ones tucked into narrow valleys, priestesses gradually formalized what the household firekeepers had practiced for centuries. By the late classical period, the temples maintained seasonal fuel logs etched in clay and organized by lunar months, ceremonial oil records detailing quantity, donor, and date of offering, burn schedules notating fire intensities for different festivals or planetary alignments. These documents weren't kept in the shrine itself. Sacred spaces had no clutter, but in adjacent firekeeper chambers, often circular rooms lined with simple amphorae and cubby shelves. In effect, the temples became archival repositories, not of theology or myth, but of flame-based logistics. Hesje's bureaucracy, a silent revolution. By the 4th century BCE, Hesje's temples were known not only for their piety, but for their operational stability. Historians of the time, like Xenophon, made rare mention of them, not because they were unimportant, but because they simply worked. One understated line from a temple steward's log reads, "No adjustments this month, supplies match prediction, ash disposal timely." Boring, yes, but consider what that meant in a world of unpredictability. While other temples vied for prestige or competed for oracles, Hesje's remained quietly effective, anchored in repetition, anticipation, adjustment. And the firekeepers, they weren't just tending flames. They were pioneering a form of bureaucratic resilience centuries before formal administrations emerged. Civic adoption, from hearth to polis. Eventually, city officials took notice. The polis, the Greek city-state, had always drawn heavily on religious ritual for civic structure. But with Hesje's temples, the interest wasn't in divination or sacrifice, it was in procedure. In some regions, temple firekeeping logs were used to guide grain storage planning. Ash removal cycles informed waste management schedules. Oil rationing patterns shaped public lighting forecasts. A record from the Bull Council in Argus noted, "Let the temple system for fire fuel inform wood allocations for winter barracks." The sacred had become the administrative. And with it, firekeeping became the foundation of something new. Urban planning through domestic logic. From flames to forms. It is easy to forget just how fragile an ancient society was. Poor inventory could mean grain spoilage, festival failures, fires going out mid-ritual. But those who followed Hesje's model came to expect stability. Some later historians, centuries after the classical period, credited her temples with reducing famine during lean years, improving festival timing through refined burn logs, standardizing temple supply chains. They even called her Hesje the Estimator, not as a goddess of flame, but as one who taught humans how to measure what truly matters. Rituals of accountability. One of the final innovations attributed to her firekeepers came in the late Hellenistic era, ritual audits. Once per season, temple workers performed a full review of fuel consumption, a count of all oil vessels, an inspection of tools, shovels, and measuring cords. Then they burned an offering of ash, and tallies a ceremonial clearing of the books. This was inventory not as dry record-keeping, but as spiritual rhythm. Use, measure, reconcile, release. One audit note survives from a small temple in Boeotia. We burn the tokens, the goddess is satisfied, we begin again. Even in bureaucracy, Hestia offered a kind of peace. The fire goes quiet. As Roman religion absorbed Greek deities, Hestia became Vesta. Her cult grew in some ways, formalizing with the Vestal virgins in Rome. But in Greece, as political shifts drew worship towards civic gods and hero cults, many Hestia temples faded into quieter roles or disappeared altogether. Yet her legacy didn't vanish, it transformed. While no new grand temples were built in her name, the system she inspired persisted in. Town planning, granary logs, military ration records, market stall inventories. Her fire may have dimmed, but the habits she inspired had caught like embers in the woodwork of society. A quiet inheritance. Today, no one prays to Hestia when updating a spreadsheet. No one lights a sacred hearth before running a quarterly inventory. And yet, every count before restock echoes her teachings. Every check the log first honors her firekeepers. Every household that knows how long its supplies will last is, in a small way, keeping the fire alive. Final reflection. Hestia never left Olympus, but her impact was felt in the kitchens, the storerooms, and the temples of the ancient world. Not through miracles, not through thunderbolts, but through quiet, relentless care. Her firekeepers, those who counted wood, rationed oil, and remembered when no one else did, created not drama, but durability. In a world where glory fades, Hestia's gift was the ability to continue. So next time you double-check a supply list, or clean out your pantry with quiet satisfaction, take a breath. You are part of a lineage, not of warriors or poets, but of those who kept the flame steady. And in that steadiness, civilization found its warmth.